Our current culture seems more interested in the last 2 minutes than the last 2,000 years. This is unfortunate. It's also avoidable. Join Mike Woodruff each week as he breaks down some of the most significant people, events, and ideas in church history. On this week's episode, Mike is going to take a look at the founding and growth of Islam and the various ways it's impacted the church over the last 1,300 years.
In Future View, a book I wrote several years ago, I argued that there were 4 glaciers, 4 slow-moving but profoundly reshaping forces at work in the world. Accelerating technology, globalization, changing social, sexual, and marital dynamics, and swirling cacophony of ideologies and beliefs. And then in the section on this swirling cacophony of ideologies and beliefs, I argued that alongside Christianity, which is the largest worldview or faith or belief, that there were 4 others in play. The first was secularism, which is not exactly atheism, although many secularists are atheists, but technically secularists are those that argue that society should operate independently of any kind of religious influence. Secularists advocate reason, which I am all for, but they do so without understanding that they have a particular bent on reason and that they operate out of a particular worldview itself. Secularists generally believe that they are neutral and only rational, and trying to help them understand that they have a worldview that shapes how they see everything is a bit like trying to explain water to a fish, but I digress. That's a different topic, so let me simply note that secularism reached its zenith 20, 30 years ago when the Soviets' official policy was atheism, as was communist China, and back when the secularization thesis was really big in the US. Secularization thesis said, which is what I grew up with going to school, it said that when we all grow up, when we get smarter, as education spreads, people will become less religious because they'll be less superstitious. That view has gone out. The best guess is about 15% of the US, of the West generally, embraces secularism. And while its influence seems to be growing because of secular people have a lot of positions of significant influence and power, the actual numbers of secularists is going down, both because philosophy has moved on, says it doesn't work, but also because secular people tend not to have many children, and demography is destiny. So look, it's not to say secularism is going to die. As I wrote in the book, it's popular in Europe, Manhattan, Harvard's faculty lounge, and the editorial offices of the New York Times. The second competing worldview out there is Buddhism, which is not the largest view coming out of the East. That would be Hinduism, but nobody thinks that Hinduism and the caste system is going to transplant itself outside of India. So Buddhism, it's worth noting, some see it as a religion, some see it as a philosophy, but it was founded 2,500 years ago in India. It encompasses a variety of beliefs and practices based on the teaching of Buddha, the Enlightened One. Primary focus is to try and help us understand and resolve suffering. And there's about 500 million Buddhists of various shapes and sizes and forms and varieties today. The third competitor to Christianity is what Robert Bellah calls Sheilaism, a term that he coined for his book Habits of the Heart. And I just use this because it's a good descriptor, if you read the book, of this sort of cafeteria religion, which is big today, where people say, without a lot of thought and without any kind of internal coherence and consistency, I believe a little bit of this, and a little bit of that, and a little bit of this. And so I'm going to take a little bit of Christianity, but reincarnation, and I like capitalism, and what Oprah said last week, and Ayn Rand, and I'm for the Cubs, and they sort of put it all together and say, and that's what I believe. Those in this camp tend to assume that all religions are essentially the same, and that whatever they want to be true is going to be true. It is, again, it's big today. There's not a lot of coherence to it, but that is the third view. The fourth view, the fourth big competitor to Christianity, indeed the biggest competitor to the Christian faith, is Islam, which is the world's second largest religion. So the same studies that suggest that there are 2 billion Christians, by very loose definitions, would say that there are 1.7 billion Muslims, and that number is growing and gaining on Christianity. It's growing almost exclusively biologically, not through conversion, and the biological growth is slowing down. But 1.7 billion, so somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 people on the planet would say that they are a Muslim. And before 9/11, most people in the West, America anyway, knew very little about Islam. That changed rather quickly. Unfortunately, it changed being shaped pretty predominantly by sort of a political, military, sort of terrorist angle on Islamic studies focus on Islamic extremism, and that is a little bit unfortunate and misleading. Most Muslims are not radicals, and Christians and Muslims have peacefully coexisted alongside each other for hundreds and hundreds of years. So today I want to talk about Islam, and I realize that that's maybe a little bit odd in a survey of the 100 most influential people, events, and ideas in the last 2,000 years of the Christian faith. I'm not doing it because I think that Islam grows out of Christianity. There are people who say that it does. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the 3 great monotheistic, the 3 great Abrahamic faiths. And there's a sense in which clearly I would affirm that Christianity grows out of Judaism. It completes Judaism. Some would argue that in the same way that Islam completes Christianity. I obviously don't believe that that's true. We're taking it on. I am focused on Islam right now because it's certainly a part of the story. In the same way that we looked at Arianism and Pelagianism and a lot of other views that were sort of wide of the mark, I think we have to look at the Christian faith. And we have to look at the Islamic faith. We also have to look at Islam because it got so big, so fast, that it ended up shaping and influencing the church over the course of the last 1,300 years. Some would argue that when the Roman Empire fell, it was replaced by the church. And that's why the Middle Ages used to be, and still are in some circles, referred to as Christendom. That the church became the dominant player after Rome fell. Some would say that after Rome fell, really it's the western half of the empire, that it was the eastern half that stepped in, the Byzantine Empire. Others would say that when Rome fell, Rome was replaced by Islam. So look, given all the interaction that has gone on between the church and the mosque over 1,300 years, given how Islam has represented one of the most significant challenges to Christian evangelism and apologetics and theology and cultural engagement, it feels like it's the right thing to bring up. So, bringing it up now, the plan is to give you a quick overview of the history of Islam, noting places that it intersected with the Christian faith, for instance, the Crusades. Talk a little bit about Muslim belief and theology, and then make a number of other observations that are a little bit less historical, but I think important to help us sort of understand the world in which we live in today. So let me start with the history of Islam. Islam was founded by an Arabian prophet named Muhammad, who was born in 570 AD. So that's why we're taking it up now. We looked most recently at Gregory the Great and Columba. These are also people born in the 6th century. So Muhammad was born in 570 AD in Mecca. And he was, for the first half of his life, he was a merchant. In 610, he claimed that an angel met with him and entrusted him with a message from the one true God. And he would end up writing down the messages that he received from this angel over the years. These make up much, not all, but much of what goes into the book of the Quran. So based on these revelations, Muhammad at some point begins to rail against the idol worship he sees around him. And at first, nobody really cared that much, but at some point, it began to be a problem. And in 622, the idol worshipers and the idol manufacturers rebelled, and they forced Muhammad to flee Mecca. And he went to Medina. And there he gained a following. And 8 years later, he returned to Mecca with an army, and he conquers it. His followers become known as Muslims. This is from the Arabic, those who submit. So Christianity and Buddhism are named after people, Christ and Buddha. Judaism is named after a region. Islam is named after a concept, and the concept is submission. So the Muslims are those who submit to Allah. So Islam is going to begin to spread pretty quickly. Muhammad will die in 632. His followers immediately break into two groups based on a disagreement over who's going to get the mantle of leadership. And so the Sunnis are those who believe that the caliphate, so the leadership of Islam, the leadership of Muslim community, is going to go to Muhammad's father-in-law, Abu Bakr, and about 90% of the world's Muslims are Shiites. Are Sunni. The Shiites are those who believe that leadership falls to Ali, which is Muhammad's son-in-law. So the dominant Sunni are going to launch a series of expansions, and we're going to enter into a 100-year period of Islamic conquest. First in the Arabian territories, and then by invasions into the land, both to the west and to the east. And they are very good and effective militarily. Shrewd tactics, fast horses, their armies are nearly always successful, and within a century of Muhammad's death, Islam has conquered 5 million square miles of former Roman Christian areas. So think the Middle East, into Asia, down into North Africa. In 638, importantly, the city of Jerusalem fell to the Muslims. And then in the early 8th century, Muslim troops invaded Europe, and they're conquering as they go. Portugal and Spain, they're stopped in France, famously by Charles the Hammer Martel at the Battle of Tours. He's an important figure, often given credit for saving Europe from Islamic conquest. Charles, also known as King Charles, he's known as Duke Charles, he's known as Charles Martel, he's known as the Hammer. Apparently Martel in Latin means hammer. There's some suggestion that maybe it's also a reference to Little Mars, which is a god of war. But Martel was born in Belgium, and he is a leader. So we don't have the nation states yet, but he's a leader of this region. They call him mayor of the palace. He's not quite king, but he's got a lot of power, independent power. And this is the area of Belgium, France, and the northern part of Germany. So think of the Franks. And he's a seasoned warrior, battle leader, and he realizes that he's going to have to do something to stop this Islamic conquest. And so he very deftly, with a smaller number of troops, is able to turn back the Islamic invasion. And some think it was just a little, sorry, it wasn't the Islamic invasion. Others say that he stops really the conquest of Europe by Islam. So he's an important player, certainly, and he's important also because he sets up the feudal system, which is going to be in place then for centuries after that. And he also is going to put in place the mechanisms that are going to emerge, that are going to unfold for the sort of re-merging, the unification of Europe under Charlemagne, which is going to be the Holy Roman Empire, the Carolingian dynasty. All of that is 100 years off. So this Charles the Hammer's Battle of Tours is not the end of Islamic expansion. In 846, they're going to sack Rome and overtake Sicily a few years later, and then it'll be another 600 years, but they will eventually overrun Constantinople, ending the 1,000-year reign of Christianity in that city, modern-day Istanbul. So at this point, most histories, church histories, Western histories, are going to jump ahead to the Crusades. We're going to take that up later because I've got a lecture specifically on the Crusades. They are a black eye on the church. They're trouble, to be sure, although few people know much about them. They actually sort of a crusading mindset for about 400 years. There's like 9 distinct crusades, and they're not always what people think. Especially Protestants tend to think that the Pope issues this horrific mandate, and all these Catholic Christians go down and they slaughter all these Muslims who are peacefully living in the Middle East. Look, it's bad. It's different than that, and we'll pick that up in its own lecture. By the way, before we get to the Crusades, it's worth noting that Islam is going to have other sources of intersection with the church, for instance, around icons, which will come up in a little bit as well. And after the Crusades, there's a half dozen places where Islam and Christianity, or where Islamic cultures, because in Islam you have no separation of church and state, and Western countries are going to meet and clash, coming out of World War II, a whole bunch of stuff happening in the Middle East around that, and then, of course, 9/11 and other things. So, just to level set the room before set up some things that are going to be important to bring out later on in future lectures. Let me say a few things about the theology of Islam. As I've noted, Islam means, it's from the Arabic word meaning submission. Christianity and Buddhism are named after people, Judaism named after a region. Islam is named after a concept. A Muslim is someone who submits to God. And it's, on the one hand, it's quite simple. Anyone can become a Muslim. You simply recite the Islamic confession of faith, the Shahada. And you do this in the presence of some witnesses, and you say, I testify that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. It's one of the shortest creeds that you can imagine. So on the one hand, it's very simple. On the other hand, it's all-encompassing. In Islam, everything falls under the scope of religion. Government, economics, arts, everything. There is no separation. There's no sacred and secular. There's no separation of culture or of church and state or mosque and state. It's all under the banner of Islam. So, while I'm on the topic of theology, one of the questions that I'm occasionally asked, or that I hear being discussed, is whether or not the God of the Bible and Allah are the same God. The God of Islam and the God of the Christian faith are the same God. So let me just note that at one level, this is sort of a discussion that can be an exercise in chasing your tail, because Allah in Arabic means God. So for centuries, there have been Arabic Christians who pray to Allah in the name of Jesus, and who pray to Allah for direction and for peace and for healing and for forgiveness of sins. And they're using the name Allah just as a French person would use the name Jew, a German would use the name goat for God. It's just the word for God. So lexically speaking, you got to be certain that you're having the right discussion. Now, when most people ask the question, are God and Allah the same? They're asking it because most people who use the term Allah are Muslims, and they're using it to refer to the Muslim God. And so, are they the same? Well, we're looking at Abrahamic faiths, we are looking at monotheistic faiths, and so there's a number of big things that are agreed upon. There's only one God, only one divine reality. God created everything that is not God. God is radically different from everything that he created. And by the way, Jews, Christians, and Muslims would all make these affirmations. God is good, he is merciful and just. God commands us to love him with our whole heart, and God commands us to love our neighbors. Jews, Christians, and Muslims would all say those things about God. But there are disagreements. So principally, the first disagreement is going to be that Christians affirm that the one indivisible God is triune, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The divine Word became flesh, that the second person of the Trinity became the incarnate God, and both Jews and Muslims would deny that. They would say that is not even monotheistic. It's not even a monotheistic claim. Muslims, by the way, say that Jesus was a prophet. They don't believe that he died on the cross. The other fundamental difference between Christianity and Islam when it comes to an understanding of the attributes or the nature of God is that Christians would say that God is love. Not just that he is loving, but that this is sort of a key aspect of his nature, and that he loves us unconditionally because he is love. So Muslims would say that God is infinitely merciful, but not that he is love or that his love is unconditional. Now, there are other significant theological disagreements. Muslims don't believe in inherited sin. For Muslims, salvation is based on works righteousness. So, by the way, it means if you're a Muslim, the only way you can be guaranteed that you are going to paradise is if you die in jihad. So there's like 5 things that a Muslim does to earn their salvation and their connection to God. The first I already mentioned is this creed: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Second is that you pray 5 times a day according to a structure and time and facing Mecca. Third is that you give alms to the less fortunate. Fourth is fasting during Ramadan, which is this month, based on a slightly different calendar than we practice. So during that month, during daylight hours, you're not to eat or smoke or be sexually active, not to swear, anger is forbidden, a number of things during that month. And then fifth, if you can, you're at least once in your life to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. So, look, Miroslav Volf, a Croatian theologian, Christian theologian from Croatia, a very thoughtful guy, wrote a whole book on whether or not God and Allah are the same. Obviously, if there's a book to be written about this topic, it's nuanced. I obviously think that the differences are significant. There's a lot of similarities, and I think we should be peaceful and engage in loving dialogue with all people. I think there's things that we can learn from Muslims, but I don't think that Christianity and Islam are close in those important senses. So let me wrap up by making a couple of general observations that come out of a historic understanding of Islam. And these will be important as we look in later lectures as Islam is going to spread. First of all, it's important to understand that most Muslims are not radical or fundamentalist. Most Muslims are not trying to walk in lockstep with Osama bin Laden or the members of the Taliban. When I was working with scholar leaders, we were providing funding for women and men from Africa, Asia, Latin America to do PhDs in theological disciplines, provided they were going to minister in their home country and continent. And one of the guys, that was just a brilliant, winsome, very dynamic scholar out of West Africa, who had grown up as a Muslim and then become a Christ follower, wanted to do a PhD in Islamic studies. And so one of the things you do in a PhD program is at some point you have to defend your proposal, your dissertation topic. And he proposed to study radical fundamentalist Islam. And the committee said no. And we were disappointed that they said no. This was early September 2001. A few days later, 9/11 hits. And the chair of the committee calls this guy back and says, after further review, we actually think there is value in having a Christian scholar study radical Islam. And I got to walk with him over the course of the next few years as he was working on this on his dissertation topic. And he argued that there were actually 7 different categories of Muslims, and that the largest globally was folk Islam, that throughout much of Africa and Asia, that there were a lot of Muslims who had more of a folk religion. It was sort of part Islam, but it was part whatever tribal or animistic faith they had that was blended together, that these people were not very well educated in many cases, and that it wasn't true Islam, but that was a large group of Muslims. He also said that in the United States, most Muslims are secular Muslims. So, look, there are many secular Christians. People who say, I grew up in a Christian family, or I live in a Christian country, and so I'm a Christian, but there's not a lot of influence of that. But yeah, I'll go to church every once in a while, or I affirm certain things, but it's much more of a hands-off. They're not praying 5 times a day. They're not engaged in that way. A third group he referred to as Orthodox Muslims, highly educated in Islam, maybe memorized the entire Quran, but not radical. And then he had a few others. The last group that he mentioned was the fundamentalist, and he put the number at about 17%, but growing. And he talked about an Islamic fundamentalist, or radical Muslim, by talking about what makes somebody a fundamentalist. What makes somebody a fundamentalist Christian? What makes somebody a fundamentalist Hindu? How are we to understand this? And the story I remember is he said, look, imagine you discover that your neighbor is going to turn his house into a strip club. And you say, no, I don't want my neighbor's house to be a strip club. So there's 3 different levels of response. You could say, I think that's wrong. I'm never going to go there. I personally am going to avoid that because I think that is wrong, that's immoral, that's sin. A second category would be to say, I think it's wrong and I'm going to do everything I can peacefully to stop it. I'm going to protest, I'm going to picket, I'm going to work with my elected officials, I'm going to try and get zoning laws changed, I'm going to do whatever I can to try and stop it. And then the third level, and this is what he would say would be a fundamentalist, the third level would be those who say, I'll burn it down, I'll throw bombs in it, I will kill people to stop this. It's wrong and it has to stop. So, look, my point here is that most Muslims, in particular in the U.S., are not radical, but there is certainly a radical movement. And historically, we've got to understand all the different aspects of Islam and the different ways that they're going to interface with Christians. One of the things to note, so Christians have a founder, right, who dies on a cross, who does not fight back. And Muslims have a prophet who does, right, who conquers with the sword. And so these are different approaches. Now, a second thing to understand about Islam is that it doesn't cede ground very willingly. Islam tends to take an area and hold it. And if it's taken the area, it believes that that area is always it and always theirs and will come back and fight for it, even hundreds of years later. So in contrast to that, Christianity begins in the Middle East, and it grows rapidly throughout the Middle East, and it spreads into Asia, and it spreads into Europe, it spreads into North Africa. And from North Africa and from Europe, it's going to jump to the US, jump to the Americas. But as it's jumping to the Americas, it sort of is burned out in the Middle East. Now the Middle East has become Islamic. And then Islam is spreading into Asia and North Africa, right, as Christianity becomes bigger in Europe. And then and now we're seeing Islam grow in Europe for a variety of reasons. So Islam tends to hold on to ground that it's taken, and some of that is through military means, and some of that is through demography at the moment. Third thing you should understand is that there's a crisis going on in Islam right now, and by now I mean the last 50 years. Not many Islamic countries are doing well. The 20th century has not been kind to Islam. Shortly after 9/11, I taught a class at Christ Church, and it was on Islam, war, and the Middle East. And among the people I brought in to speak, I brought in a couple Muslim leaders. And I remember we had a speaker from the Islamic Foundation, from a speakers bureau. It was a woman. And she was teaching, what is Islam and how do you understand it? And she said, Islam is a religion of peace. and then I remember she says, we honor Jesus more than you do. And I thought, wow, I haven't heard that before. And so it was great. It was wonderful. We wanted a representative of Islam to tell us what Muslims believed. In the Q&A, I remember asking her, so you're saying that Islam is peaceful and it's wonderful and all these things. Which Islamic country would you like to live in? I think there's like 20 of them. And they're not doing well. And this has been a real problem for Muslims. In an article 10, 15 years ago in the Atlantic Monthly called What Went Wrong, Bernard Lewis suggested that the last century has just been it's been very difficult for Muslims because it was obvious they were not thriving in the Middle East. They were not thriving necessarily in North Africa. Islam was falling behind in so many different areas, and it was increasingly clear that they weren't even second. And they were losing battles. They were losing in education. They were losing in all kinds of ways. And politically, they'd had this, a series of sort of failed states. So this humiliation of Muslims had been a very dominant culture, a very educated culture, very high culture, lots of wonderful things coming out of Islam over the last 1,300 years. But it has had a rough go of it the last 100 by just about any objective assessment. And so that's a problem, and it's created a little bit of a crisis in Islam. So the reformers are saying that the reason Islam has fallen behind is because there is no separation of mosque and state, and women have been denigrated and they don't get an education. But women, just to understand, when women are not educated in a culture, the children don't get educated because they're the ones that are going to be doing the education of the next generation. And so it really pulls a country down just dramatically. Of course, the Islamic fundamentalists say that the reason that Islam is suffering is because it's not being true to the law, Sharia law that it needs to follow. Well, look, there's a whole lot more that could be said, will be said over the course of the next 80 lectures. We could talk about a number of things. We could talk about the number of Muslims who are coming to faith around the world, often through dreams. It's been a big thing in the last 5 years. And I've talked with some who have, living in countries that are very closed to a traditional Christian gospel, but they have dreams and meet Jesus and have sincere, real conversions. And so there's a lot. I just wanted to introduce the birth of Islam today. And it's going to be important as we move through the Middle Ages. It's going to be important as we get to, obviously, the Crusades. In many different ways, it is going to shape the Christian faith. The next one up, the next episode, episode 80, we're going to look at a Benedictine monk. Again, this one from the northern parts of England, who will become a saint. His name is Bede, the Venerable Bede. He's going to write a book that becomes very important. No other work of such kind of erudite scholarship is going to happen for a couple hundred years. And I'm going to use the opportunity in talking about Bede to talk about the way Christianity influences the life of the mind and how that has shaped the church and it has shaped Western culture. So that's next time.